said, we'll continue up quite handily chapter 1, and also what I sort of did was I saved the fun part for last this week or this chapter. So that's where we're at. And should we start off by reminding ourselves what our working definition of culture is? I suppose that I'm actually waiting for you to tell me if we should start off that way. I think it would be a good place to start, is to summarize where we were last time. And we said that our working definition of culture is going to have three key elements. It's going to have a set of adaptations that arise out of this really complex interaction between people and groups of people and their environment. And so that's element 1, is adaptations or adaptive behavior. So stuff that arises out of this. Almost like what the fancy term for that might be like epiphenomenon. So we're going to make the argument that culture arises out of this other more substantial stuff. And it sort of rides on top of that. We call that perhaps an epiphenomenon. Element number 2 is going to be that it has to be shared. It can't be just your idea or your set of adaptations. We would call that personality psychology. That's Psych 3277 here at Macon State. So wrong class, right? It has to be shared by a group of people. And the third element is that has to be should have a means of replicating itself, or a way of reproducing itself over time. So it's transmitted across generations, all right? Keeping in mind here, it's obviously not transmitted through genes, right? It's transmitted socially through other means. And that's kind of cool too. All right, and we also left you last time with a little brief handout to do, and we won't go over that today, but I hope that we will remember to come back to that in December and really, really look back and say, aha, look, I was wrong on that, I was right on that, I was getting close on that. And if you recall what that is it's a little sheet of what do you already know about psychology and whether or not it varies across culture, some of the major findings. And so if you haven't had a chance to do that first activity, take a peek at it and fill it out and keep that for your own reference, and you can also put that in your 3-ring folder and turn that in as well. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about, come see me after class, okay? All right, so let's continue on. Look at all this good stuff we did. I think I want to say a little bit more about Cohen 2009. And he's got those examples or some ideas. Now, when you read through this American Psychologist article, you will see that he's kind of given you some broad strokes, some little mini summaries of where cross-cultural psychology has been since it became a subfield. And what he focuses on is 3 main examples of cultural differences that have been explored in the literature fairly extensively. And I think, by the way, if you had never seen this article, and if I locked you in a room long enough and said you have to come up with the 3 most common ways that people are that culture is examined as far as groups of people go and psychological characteristics go. And I think you would have come up with at least 2 of these, if not the whole list of 3 things. So in other words, don't psych yourself out. This isn't some new list to memorize. These are major ways that human beings differentiate themselves. Actually, now that I think about it, and now that I've just said it like that, there's actually some things that are missing, which are ways that people often categorize people that either he didn't touch upon or just wholly missing from this analysis here in this article. But Cohen gives us, all you have to do is look at the headings within the article. He says that religion has been investigated as an example of cultural differences. Right? And the nice thing about that, of course, is that if you have a multicultural, or a really diverse society like America, you can examine cultural differences in based on religion. So you can study religious culture within the national culture, right? Within the American culture. So you can kind of control for some of the major ways that people vary, while then examining a little bit more closely religion. Next way, social class, right? And so it's not always said like that. I always purposely use that old-fashioned term. Social class is not something that people talk about. It's one of the really interesting aspects of American culture is that we don't talk about it outright. And I've always found that really fascinating. So I make sure, as part of my duty, I view myself not just when I'm in the classroom, but when I'm out there in the world, as my duty to, I owe it to myself and to my fellow human beings to challenge them. So, and that's what I think I'm doing. That's an overall summary statement of what I do as a teacher, is I show you different things and make you think and challenge you. And so I always talk about social class whenever I can. I make it explicit. And of course, it's sort of taboo to talk about, right? So does anyone in here want to identify as being solidly middle class, which would seem like a stock neutral answer with not a lot of emotional baggage? But even that would seem kind of threatening to say. Yeah, I'm solidly middle class. Anyone in here aspire to be upper class? And keep in mind, unless you've got a trust fund, unless something really amazing happens to you in your life, you're not likely to ever be upper class. And maybe that's okay, right? Maybe that's okay. But I think many of us, if you look at pop culture and movies and so forth, I think that for many of us the goal is to be upper middle class, right? Which is to be comfortable, to live the kind of standard American life. I think that's actually the American dream. I don't think the American dream is Lamborghinis in the driveway, right? And it's multiple houses, beach houses. Which, by the way, what am I hearkening back to get that image from? Your poster on your bedroom wall when you were in high school. No, just me? Oh, okay. You used to go to Spencer or any of these little shops, and you would have this long poster on the wall, and it would have, of course, the sun would be setting, there'd be palm trees, and there'd be this Miami Vice style house, and there'd be 3 Lamborghinis in the 3-car garage, right? And that's supposed to be what we're aspiring to. That's really a cartoon of what I think any of us really want out of life. But that said, it'd be nice to have. I don't know if it would be nice to have. Would you want to worry about that your car that you're driving around is more expensive than the average house? I mean, really? Driving around Macon? He's like, I love it. He's like, unapologetically, yeah. Yeah, I want those problems. Oh, you're right.
You're not worried about your house.
Here's what I like. You guys get bonus points for listening today because you're right. In my fantasy example, we have 3 Lamborghinis. So what does it matter if one of them gets scratched, right? So, okay. All right. So back to our idea here. The other major way that cross-cultural psychology over the last couple of decades has been examined is looking at social class differences. And those are everywhere. And those are huge. And in many ways, it's kind of almost beside the point to even talk about it in the post-Occupy Wall Street era, right? We're all the 99%. Now, I'm not being political here. What I'm saying is that, I'm basically making an argument for the middle class as kind of the norm or the standard. But social class is something that we're in the midst of having a pretty explicit conversation about, and I think that's a good thing. The standard term, by the way, the more accepted polite term is to say socioeconomic status, or to abbreviate it as SES. And the only reason why that's more polite is because most people don't know what the heck you're talking about right? I mean, lay people don't. You folks are educated now, so you know what SES means. And it always feels a little bit dirty, actually, to say SES, depending on how much you mumble when you say it, right? So be careful. People are like, what are you talking about? SES. SES. Okay, socioeconomic status. So that's another way. And the third way, which I always thought was trivial, although it's kind of fun, and it gets back to the soda versus pop thing and some of my comments, having transcended cultural barriers, moved below wherever that Mason-Dixon line is, pretty far down. And did I tell you I drove to Western New York this summer with my kid? And so we drove there and back, and all it did was make me depressed. Here's the thing, not because I missed where we were going to, it made me depressed to realize how far away I actually am. I've flown back there several times since, and that's only a 2-hour flight. But when you drive it and it takes a day and a half with stopping, and you realize, holy crap, I ain't in Kansas anymore, or I ain't in Western New York anymore, okay? And so nobody up there talks like that either. But anyway, so the third major way that Cohen talks about is region of the country. And that becomes really interesting too and really pronounced. And that is also touched upon by Matsumoto towards the end of chapter 1. He talks about how it's silly to think of nation or nationality as synonymous with culture, because we know all too well that even when you look within a nation, especially one as large and as diverse as the United States, that there's key regional differences, right? And that's part of the reason why you travel, is to experience these differences. And it's sort of like when you go to San Francisco, you want to get the San Francisco experience, right? When you go to California for the first time, you want to experience California. You want to see, well, what is this all about? I want to feel some of that magic. And maybe I was looking too hard, but I didn't have to look. I will never forget the first time I landed at LAX, and from the first moments at the baggage carousel, I realized, oh yeah, this is a different place. People, notably the women, but also the guys, were all very good looking, had either really good knockoffs designer clothes on or just designer clothes on. When we got our rental car and got out just on Sepulveda Boulevard, just right out of the LAX terminal, the light looked different. The way that the sun was hitting the sky, and if you've been to California, you know what I'm talking about. It had like a light lemony yellow hue to it. That's
just better.
What's that?
But everything's just better.
Everything's better. Even graffiti looks better, right? It does. It looks awesome, actually. And so I wanted that, and I.
Different places just to see. Thank you. When you look at it, it's like, how in the heck did they get up there?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and it's got a different style to it. Those of you who are connoisseurs of rap know that there's an East Coast sound and a West Coast sound, right? When you go to New Orleans, right, another region of the country, I don't know if you only exclusively go to New Orleans if you'll get it, but you're not going to get the whole Bayou country thing, but you certainly get some influence of that. New Orleans feels like a unique cultural place based on region, right? When you go to Charleston, it's no mistake that you've stepped into another world, right? When you go to New York City, you sort of stepped into the world, right? And that was always fascinating for me, being from New York State, but back when the speed limit was 55 miles an hour, a 7-hour drive from New York City. And so one of my earliest memories of going to New York City, one of my earliest thoughts was, I can't believe this is still New York State, or this still counts as New York State. And wow, look, everyone here has the same kind of license plate as me, but boy, this is so radically different from the New York that I know, right? And the New York that I know looks an awful lot more like Central Georgia than New York City or even Atlanta. But so region of the country produces some really interesting differences, right? East Coast, West Coast, North, South. I think there was another one that Matsumoto mentioned. Oh, Midwest is another key one. And that's 5. That's 5 different regions that are major divisions. And they're not things that I think are going away anytime soon, right? I think we sort of celebrate it now, and that's okay. There's room for all those differences. So those are 3 ways. Now, back to what we said at the beginning. Anything surprising in this kind of almost seminal modern article on cross-cultural psych and kind of this overview of the field? Any major divisions that you might have thought Cohen could have focused on in this article as examples of culture? It's another big, we talk about religion, social class, and region of the country, right? How about race or ethnicity? He didn't mention that really at all. Although many of his examples that sort of kind of center, they kind of combine those other 3 in kind of interesting ways. All right, so I love the question that he gives us on page 194 to get us thinking about culture, right? In what ways does an English-speaking male Jew raised in the United States share a cultural outlook with his Yiddish-speaking Jewish great-grandmother who lived in Eastern Europe, right? And you think, my goodness, there's genetic blood ties there, right? And there's certainly some cultural ties through the religious practices, but my goodness, almost every other way that matters, these are people from 2 different cultures, right? And so he's making this passionate argument for, let's not have a one-dimensional idea of what culture is, and let's not have a one-dimensional idea of what an individual person is or where they come from. And he says, and for that matter, or with a modern Hebrew-speaking Jew who lives in Israel, what cultural connections or parity does he share? Obviously, he's using himself as an example, right? Or maybe that's not obvious to you. But that's something that specific should make you think, he's probably talking about himself, probably autobiographical. Let's see here. Continuing on, I love the statement on page 200, which again just emphasizes the point of many different ways, many forms of culture. On page 200, it just says first line or two under the multiculturalism heading. We usually consider a person to be multicultural if he or she has lived in more than one country or has parents representing more than one ethnic group. Isn't that interesting? That's the old school way of remembering things, right? You're only multicultural if you're from more than one country, or if you have parents from more than one ethnic group. Isn't that interesting? Right? That's definitely the old school way of looking at it. And I'll have to tell you, that old school way led me to not really think I had any culture, or that I represented any culture, until I got a little bit more educated and did some more thinking about it, right? If you had asked me 10 years ago, do you have maybe 15 years ago, do you have a culture? Who are your people? I'd say, I'm American. I don't know. I don't have any ethnicity. I don't have any culture. I'm just standard, boring, blasé. And of course, I know how naive those ideas are now, right? But boy, what a challenge to have someone ask you that for the first time. Going back to the clothing argument, and also, are fish aware of water? Are you aware of your culture if that clothing fits just so well, and if no one's ever confronted you with that question? Good question. All of us should have that experience of being confronted at some point. So, however, another implication of studying more forms of culture is that there are many forms of multiculturalism, and that all people are, in fact, you rarely see writing quite that clearly and direct, saying all people are, in fact, multicultural. So it's not just a matter of, it's not an optional thing. You are multicultural. So even if you pick the most monolithic cultural group that you can, and you're still going to have men and women, so you're still from that cultural group, plus you are either male or female, right? And so then that's the beginning point. Notice the article doesn't talk about gender either, just because that's such a well-tread distinction, especially in the scientific literature, or social science literature. All right. Another way to get at this idea of what is culture is to not just look at examples of it, and of course that's where we're going to go in just a little bit, is look at some fun examples, but also say, well, what doesn't count as culture, right? So we could try out our definition, and I like what your textbook author does, only because I think it's challenging. This is kind of a selective list starting on page 20 and continuing until the top of page 22 in your textbook. A selective list of, okay, let's not confuse this for sure. There might be some wiggle room or some gray area when for confusing culture with nationality, although please don't do that. Culture with language, culture with ethnicity, etc. But culture is not race. And you can read through that discussion there and get a little hint of where social science and psychology in particular is moving with race. Wherever possible, just to kind of give you a little heads up here, psychology is moving very quickly away from even using the word race. Actually, I've seen many articles calling out for it to not be considered a scientific concept, mostly because there's not even consider this, the most basic requirement is something factual that we can hang on to. There's no genetic basis for race. There's no markers for race. So you can look at someone's blood and or their gene profile, and you wouldn't be able to tell their race based on that. That's a starting point for a very, very large conversation. And I don't mean to just tell you what to think, but keep in mind, if you continue on in psychology over the next 5 to 10 years, I think you'll see that less and less. And so if we have difficulty with the concept of race as a bona fide concept of study, we certainly aren't going to make the mistake of confusing culture with race. All right. By the way, what is it being replaced with? The idea of ethnicity, which seems to be a lot more important and actually a lot more specific in describing what it is that we mean when we're describing certain aspects of people. Also, be careful here. Don't confuse culture with personality, and that it sort of goes back to our definition that we're using, our working definition. Culture is bigger than personality, but also remember what your definition of personality is. And many of you maybe haven't had a full-blown course in personality yet, but you have touched upon it in some of your lower-level coursework. But personality, by definition, is your unique stamp, your unique behavioral profile. And culture is just the opposite of that, right? The culture says we can allow you to operate within the confines of your uniqueness, of your personality, of your particular pattern of individual differences. So we can allow for that, but there's still going to be something there, some hint, some substrate that you as an individual kind of sticks in or walks through or swims through, and that's going to be called culture. So it's almost a complete opposite of the idea of personality. Personality is the study of individual differences. Culture is the study of, are there any group-level aggregate differences among the peoples of the world? So, different level of analysis, all right? And then, this is my favorite of all, is, how about, don't confuse culture. This is your textbook author saying this. I don't agree with him, but the more I'm reading this, the more I think about this, about his arguments, the more I'm starting to be convinced, all right? And so, we also use the word pop culture a lot, right? So, or pop or popular culture, and certainly that's something that's real. You can hold it in your hand, you can see it. Who's going to give us some examples of pop culture? Something from your own life. Who wants to do it? These are fads, fashions, things you're into that do have their own unique meaning systems, their own codes of conduct, the rules for behaving when you're doing that thing. All right, so I'll give you the example that is hanging in the air for me. Dragon Con. Who's going to Dragon Con this weekend? Always get at least one hand coming up. Okay. I am. Dork alert, geek alert. So here's the thing. I was told this back in 2006 when I came here by my students. They said they were pleading with me. You could tell at different times different students would come up to me and they really meant it. They were pleading with me. I'm giving you some really good advice for what the good life is in Georgia. And I got lots of different things, and they've always turned out to be just about spot on, right? Still haven't taken the advice to go to Destin, Florida yet. I don't know. I'm kind of sick of hearing about Destin, Florida. Haven't been to Tybee Island yet, and I know. 6 years. I've driven past it many times to get to a different beach. So, anyways, I haven't been to Savannah yet, although I've been through it about a dozen times. On my way to Charleston.
Yeah. If you've been to Charleston, you've been to Savannah.
Well, people tell me, here's the deal. I haven't heard that one yet. What I keep hearing is Savannah is better than Charleston. And people say if you like Charleston, you will love Savannah. And I have to tell you, my heart hurt when I was in Charleston because it was just so awesome. I don't think I could. If that's true about Savannah, I don't think I could take it. Right? Because I've never seen a place more beautiful than Charleston. And I've told that to some people, and they laugh. That if they're from one guy in particular from South Carolina, not from Charleston, and he says that's an S-hole, that's a cesspool, and all you smell is nastiness. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah, they have 16th century plumbing there. I'm like, really? I didn't notice that. I just noticed how awesome it was and how beautiful it was, and the culture and the food and the music, and oh my God, the ocean right there. Okay, so so that was another example of that. Sorry. Dragon Con was one of them, and I ignored that advice for 3 years. But I did do it. And I was like, oh my God. They're like, you have to take your kid to go see Dragon Con. And so first year I just did the parade. I'm like, oh, one of the best parades I've ever been to. And so anyways, this is, we're going. That's geek culture. All right? Super geek culture. These are people who care about things that people probably shouldn't spend time caring about. Go on the Dragon Con website and take a look at some of the talks that there are, and there's going to be jam-packed rooms for some of these talks of how to hold the swords just right, and things like that. Right? It's like a Alice in Wonderland kind of cultural event where you go in big picture, and then you can keep winding around and get it more specific and more specific and more detailed. And then little subcultural groups come out of that, like steampunk, which I just learned about a year ago, comes out of that. Has anyone ever heard of steampunk? Steampunk is fascinating, and it's part of geek culture. And yes, it is. How would you describe it?
Is that where they make like modern technology look old?
Yeah, they do like superheroes and pop culture figures and things like that, but they reimagine them as if it's from the 1900s where there was steam driving things, right?
You can see
But
like all the piping and all
you
the
can,
old
you
clothing.
got it. Piping, and you can see gears, and it's kind of cool.
I thought
We don't know why it's cool, but it's cool. So anyways, that's an example of pop culture. What else would be pop culture? You know, the Avengers. I mean, you can get different with that. The Avengers this summer. Hunger Games is pop culture, right? In 2 years, no one will ever... Well, I guess we have to wait for the whole trilogy to come out in theaters, and then add 4 years, and then no one will ever talk about it again, right? So I think there might be a legitimate argument that that's not culture. Here's another good one from this summer that I can stop. I can't wait to stop hearing about. Something gray. 50 Shades of Grey. Good God! Would that thing go away, whatever that is. So sick of hearing about that.
Hey, just on that note,
Uh-oh.
be lucky that your name isn't Christian and that your girlfriend's name isn't Anna, who are the 2 characters in the
Oh,
book,
wow.
because I hear about it constantly.
Yeah, and do they like...
Constantly.
They smirk at you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, see, I don't really know what you're talking about, but if those are the main characters in that, then I sort of know what you're talking about. Okay, so that's what we mean by pop culture. Smurfs, G.I. Joe, Saturday morning cartoons, TV Funhouse. I mean, we could free associate for the next hour and come up with 3,000 examples of pop culture. Okay? All right, so why doesn't that count as culture? It's got specific practices that would not exist anywhere else unless you're participating in that culture. You wouldn't do those things, see those things, feel that way. So it definitely has those adaptive behaviors. Yes?
What about art? Is that culture?
What kind of art?
Well, you're talking about pop culture and
Interesting.
Like famous artistic depictions of pop culture, and that would be considered pop
Okay, so now before we go right to like pop art, which is actually a kind of a melding avant-garde kind of stuff, what about art? So so we look at Impressionism or something, right? And how does something that's just kind of a fad, or what people are doing right now, or maybe even the cutting edge of where a discipline is at, how does that become pop culture, and then how does it transcend that and become high culture, right? We all know what high culture is, and you've heard of this high-low divide. I think maybe that's why you were thinking of this, is because pop culture is sometimes also called low culture, right? And it's culture for the masses. And of course, when you start throwing in people like Andy Warhol into the mix, who actually made high art out of mass-produced things that were cheap and available to everybody, you start seeing people playing around with this idea of what's high and what's low, what counts, what's highbrow, what's lowbrow, right? The argument that we're making here is that there's a whole swath of things that we really think are groovy and cool and invest tons of time and energy and resources in, typically entertainment for entertainment purposes, that we're going to say is not culture. None of those are examples of culture. Then what are they then? Well, that's something else, and it's low, and it's not important. That's the argument that we have to hear what the reasoning is for that. But that's where we're trying to go. Yes.
At what point does something that started off as, say, pop culture become actual culture?
Yeah. So the
For
question,
example.
you guys hear the question? At what point does something that started off as pop culture become high culture?
For example, you're talking about just like books and movies and whatnot. About things like Lovecraft,
Lovecraft?
H.P. Lovecraft, or Tolkien.
Oh, I gotcha.
For quite a while that
There's a good example
kind of
people
just
would
keeps
know.
coming and keeps-
So Tolkien, for sure, used to be a niche little thing, right? I mean, it might have been fantastic, and it might have been the kind of thing that spread by word of mouth, and you got to read this, and oh my God, you're into that? Check this out, right? You can imagine this. And now, of course, it's obviously a worldwide thing, and it's considered one of the finest examples from the last 100 years of high fantasy. And so many people would describe that as art, and not just the film adaptations, but the actual writings of Tolkien, and the language and when did it cross over, and what are the requirements for that? I don't think we know that. And keep in mind, if this class could answer that question, this would be like a cultural factory, right? I mean, a cultural workshop, and we'd have to charge you more money, I think. A lot more money. What's that? Yeah, someone came up with the canon, right? The great works. I mean, this is a fascinating debate, by the way, right? You guys have heard of the Western canon, right? And it turns out, who hasn't heard of the Western canon before? Okay, so, wait, I'm sorry. Who has heard of the Western canon before? And it's not a military thing. So about half of you. So the Western canon is this, quote-unquote, notice I have to do quotes and stuff because we're in this kind of gray area, this list of great works. And of course, that's been under attack for decades now. Well, you mean great works by white guys who speak English. Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, I mean, we're beyond that kind of cynicism. But it turns out that there is no one accepted great books list. And so you can, and here's the thing, I'll challenge you, if you're curious to know, okay, I want to know, what 100 books should I have read that are great examples of English literature? You can Google that, Google the Western canon, Google the great books with capital letters, and you'll get 50 different lists, and with not a lot of overlap, right? I mean, there'll be some things that are on there. And so,
Some things that make it a point that the old stuff on it. One list didn't even put the Bible.
Well, there you go. I mean, should the Bible be on there, right? Should Moby Dick be on there?
Say the Bible, it should be.
What's the most recent thing that's allowed to be on the on the great books? Can the author still be alive? I mean, so who gets to decide these rules, right? And so keep in mind that's not what this class is. It's sort of where we're at in this little lecture here. But boy, if we knew the answers to this, boy, how much fun would that be, right? If we could somehow delineate, I'm sure, by the way, that in the humanities they might have a class on culture that has some more specific answers, but it's probably more or less a variety of theories on this line of thinking says that this predicts that this is when something will become art and when not, and then there's 20 other theories that differ on that theme. So, all right, let's hear the arguments against pop culture. And what's nice is, of course, the whole reason why we're doing this is because it speaks to the definition that we are using of culture. All right, and I'm starting to listen, as I said, to Matsumoto a little bit more. I'm more willing to listen to these arguments. All right? Okay. So, he concedes, Matsumoto concedes, that pop culture does have adaptive behaviors that have shared meaning. All right? And so that would seem to be the key starting point element. But, okay, adding another element here that we don't have on our list of 3 things. This second paragraph under that heading on page 21 says, popular culture and culture as we define it share some similarities, but there are also important differences. For one, pop culture does not necessarily involve sharing. Here's the key. He's adding a 4th element here, which we are not going to add in this class. But you should know it as an argument against pop culture, as one argument against pop culture. He says that people who participate in a pop culture phenomenon, such as remember when Spider-Man came out 10 years ago? All the rage. And remember when Spider-Man came out this summer? There's actually a backlash to it. What's that? Or when comic book movies first, like for instance, Yeah. And so, these things, they're like wisps. But here's the argument. People who participate in pop culture do not share, they might share the interest in that thing, but he's arguing, and I don't know if this is the right assumption, if this is an okay assumption to make, that people who participate in a pop cultural phenomenon do not share a wide range of psychological attributes across various psychological domains. Interesting. So what he's arguing here is that to be properly thought of as culture, that something has to, it involves a system of rules that cut across attitudes, the individual members' values, opinions, beliefs, norms, and behaviors, and not just while they're doing that thing. And so, I'm willing to admit, okay, yeah, we all know someone who's really into something, like they're really, really, really into baseball, right? But when baseball's not on, it's not baseball season, and they're not in a baseball mode or with baseball outfit on, you wouldn't know it. So that's the argument that they're making, that while you're doing the activity, sure, wow, I mean, that's part of the fun of going to these conventions or to these events, is, wow, you're just like me, I had no idea. Yeah, you're just like me in this context. So I'm starting to see that and agree with that a little bit more. However, again, back to the Dragon Con geek culture. I don't think it's so easily dismissed. In other words, I don't think it's so easy to say that the 20,000 people who are going to take over downtown Atlanta this weekend, that they don't share some common set of beliefs and attitudes, behaviors, and norms, right? They're geeks. And so here's the thing. Maybe you say, well, geek isn't pop culture. That's geek culture. So let's make sure let's make sure that we're differentiating. See the difference there? So pop culture is, oh, you're into Star Trek, you're into this, you're into that. But you're making the argument, whatever they share, or I'm making the argument, whatever it is that they share, is something broader called geek culture or geek personality. So then we might actually be able to properly call being a geek as part of a culture, but not the specifics of pop culture itself, because that kind of is temporary, it's transient. All right. And he goes one step further here. He says, in this one, I think he's completely off base on. But his next major argument, he's only got two major arguments against pop culture counting, is that there's no cultural transmission. I think that's completely underestimating the power of mass media. It's completely underestimating the role of social learning in the maintenance of pop culture, right? And so when the original Star Wars came out, I was 3. I did not see it. I wasn't part of that. But in the first movie, in Empire Strikes Back, I think it was rated. Well, they didn't have PG-13 back then, but for some reason I wasn't taken to that either. So, child abuse or something. But the first movie I went to in the Star Wars trilogy was Return of the Jedi. I saw that in the theater, and I would have been like 8 or 9 at the time. And so, so what I'm trying to argue here is that Star Wars wasn't part of who I am, right? But it's still something that I embraced and got into. Fast forward, 15 years, I saw it again in my early 20s, right, when they re-released them and did all the crap to the movies. And then here's the thing, then fast forward 10 years when I get my kid. My kid is born, okay, now he has to grow up a little bit. Now he's 4. Aha. Here's this thing called Star Wars. Would you like to watch it with me? Okay. Not forcing it on him, but what do you think of that? Oh, really? Interesting. You want to keep talking about it? Let's buy some t-shirts. Let's buy some Legos. Let's buy some posters. Let's buy some bedding. And before you know it, this kid's, not life is taking over, but close to it. A lot of the fun parts of life now involve Star Wars and superheroes and other geek things, right? So, taking this idea of cultural transmission across generations literally, it happens. And I'm not just some errant example of this, right? Not to mention, it happens spontaneously in our culture. And there's actually been lots written about this. Really fascinating articles that people are trying very hard to peg the cycles of culture, the cycles of pop culture. For instance, remember, when was it? I don't know the precise years for it, but was it the early 2000s or the late 90s? Flipping over into the maybe 2000, 2001. When did bell bottoms come back? Was it not? So it was the late 90s, early 2000s. The 70s came back hard, right? In fashion, in music. Actually, remember Beck? Beck could have been playing back in the 70s, right? And so that would be about, what would that would be about a 20 to 25 year period of time. Other people have put it at about a 15-year cycles. Right after that, in the mid-2000s, the 80s exploded back, complete with leg warmers, and people started French rolling their pants again. Girls started wearing like stirrup tights again. Started wearing like colors that shouldn't go together again, like lots of neon pink and stuff. Remember this stuff? This was like 5, 6, 7 years ago. What do we predict next? I think the 90s are going to come back. If you remember, the 90s were marked by grunge. Well, hip-hop, fairly hardcore hip-hop, but also grunge with flannels. So you watch. Start buying stock in companies that make flannels. Right? Remember plaid flannels with like messy jeans and like Timberland boots, and you just smelled. And you would just bang your head. It wasn't headbanging. It was like headbanging for the masses, right? You get in the mosh pits, remember? That's coming back in the next 5 years. You heard it here first. All right? And here's the thing. In the 50s are one of those classic decades that's always there, right? Just ask the Gap, right? The Gap has basically patented the 50s. But that stuff happens naturally, and with just a little bit of effort and some marketing push behind it, then you get that. Then you get it for sure to happen. You can be guaranteed that it will happen. So I don't know. I don't think you can make much of an argument. But let's listen to the actual words. Ready? Let's see here. Let's see. Popular culture refers to values or expressions that come and go as fads or trends within a few years. Oh yeah, and don't ever come back, or don't ever morph into other new things, and you tack on new elements, and it gets transformed in really fascinating ways. I mean, there's people who spend their lives studying this, right? It becomes fascinating, and most of us participate in multiple different pop cultural elements. Culture, on the other hand, is relatively stable over time. So adding kind of a fifth element here, right? Saying, oh yeah, and for it to really be culture, it has to be stable over time, which is hard when you say stable over time and then modify it with the word relatively, right? That's sort of ironic to say relatively stable over time and even across generations. Despite its dynamic quality and potential for change, yeah, that's called pop culture. So, I don't know. I'm still on the fence here, but I am starting to open up to Matsumoto's ideas that things that are just clearly fashions or fads of the moment probably shouldn't count. However, it can feel like they have the pervasive effects of culture. So they do become good entry points into this discussion over what counts and what doesn't. All right. Okay. Spent a little bit more time on that than perhaps we might have wanted to, but potentially got off into some. You could see where this can connect with some humanities kind of studies. All right, and so this is just going to give up on me, isn't it? All right. Oh, let's see. Let me give some other examples. Before we do this, well, okay, let me give you an example. So another way of looking at this, and perhaps also still talking about pop culture a little bit, but also talking about how historical cohort level change happens and how an entire generation can get stamped upon, right? And so here's an example of what we mean by that. If you meet somebody for the first time and they tell you, hey, I came of age in the late 60s, you feel like you'd be justified in saying, I know quite a bit about you already, don't I? Now, are you stereotyping? Yes, of course. But I mean, that's what you're doing. You're using the cultural knowledge, historical knowledge, generational knowledge, and saying, all right, I've already got some ideas of what your issues are, what your approach to life is, across a whole swath of attitudes, values, opinions, beliefs, etc. Right? And we even have names for people of different generations. These are baby boomers. You folks are Gen Y for the most part. Right? And I always like this, I'm solidly Gen X, and that used to be something that was a mark of shame, just to let you know. I remember in the mid to late 80s, Gen X being described as the first loser generation, right? We were described as losers who were failures before we even graduated from high school. You think I'm crazy? I could find you references if you want it. So when Gen Y came along, which I think might be you folks, or some of you folks, you have to forgive me when a Gen Xer says, I think that stands for Y, as in W-H-Y question mark. Ooh, all right, put the boxing gloves on, right? Y. I know your folks are also called, and this actually might be the half generation after you, called millennials, or we're even starting to hear the use of the word post-millennials. And so millennials would be people who came of age around the millennium. Remember what that was 12 years ago? Right? And so now we're starting to get post-millennials. And the idea here is that a time period, especially with respect to cultural elements that run across major domains of life, of everyday life, stamps on you. And so here we have this mindset list. I'm sure some of you have seen this before, that this gets emailed to us by the head counselor here at Macon State, the head of the counseling center. This actually, I'm starting to think now, this was accurate as of like 2 weeks ago, and I think they just added 2016. So those who started college this year are class of 2016. You folks are not class of 2016, right? This is, we should do a chant and a cheer. No! Say hell no! I'm a junior at least, and I'm not going to take 4 more years, right? Yes. And
2016 for master's.
yes, there you go. Class of 2016 for graduate school. I will buy that. All right, so I'm going to click on this link. It might take me to the old list. Notice the way in which this is presented to us. You don't understand your students if you haven't read through this list and given it some thought. So you need to understand the generation of students who's sitting in your classroom. And I sort of already do, because you folks, for example, did not know about the STAR report. All right, let's see what we have here. Here's the 2015 list. It's already been updated. There's now a new list, 2016. So where's just the list? Here it is. All right, now keep in mind, we're not going to read through them all. There's too many things on here. There's like 100 things on here. But the idea is, cumulatively, over all these things here, it means that you folks have a different approach and orientation. Not you folks. These folks have a different way of looking at the world and experiencing the world. It's changed their attitudes, their values, etc. That's the classic concept of a cohort. So what do we have here? They should keep their eyes open for Justin Bieber or Dakota Fanning at freshman orientation. The really cool thing, in other words, part of it is those kids are old enough, those babies are old enough to go to college, which is amazing. But one of the things that this does to you, and it did it to me a while ago, is that when you become an adult in your 30s, you start to, when your first boy band or sensation like comes out, like Justin Bieber, or what's that new one? New Dimension? One Dimension? New Direction? One Direction? Okay, see, we have some combination of those words, right? New Edition? No. One Dimension? Oh, One Dimension would be too funny, wouldn't it? One Direction, when they come out, I mean, here's the thing. They were on Saturday Night Live like in April or May, like one of the last episodes from last season. And my wife and I, it was like great fun for us to watch. We're like, oh my God, that's like NSYNC or Backstreet Boys. And even then, we used to make fun of them. Can't believe how they manipulate and just do the same formula. It's like press play, right? And they had like one guy in that band who represents every like little demographic of who they want to spend, and they can't sing worth a damn, and they all do the same corny dance moves, but the music is so catchy, right? But I refuse to buy it. I will not buy it. All right, so here's the thing. Well, when you get in your 30s, you see that, and you're like, oh, that's why people were making fun of me with New Kids on the Block. I remember. And I was not in the New Kids on the Block. They were a threat to me, right? Right? Because they were my competition. I can't tell you how many dates I was on when New Kids on the Block would come up. And how do you win in any conversation where it's you wanting to do something with somebody and New Kids on the Block enters the conversation? You can't win, right? You can't win. All right. So I would imagine there's every guy in the world, probably nowadays, every 16-year-old hates Justin Bieber, just to let you know. I don't know that for a fact, but I'm imagining. They've always lived in cyberspace, addicted to a new generation of electronic narcotics. I've never even heard that phrase before, but it's probably apt. I think I've already mentioned in here before that when I was in college, when I started college, there was no email. And by my junior year, there was email. So I actually got to experience college with both. And of course, we're talking, printing out your email on dot matrix. I have a folder of some of my first emails, and it's printed out on dot matrix. You guys know what that is? Its printers were so crappy that they made things out of little dots instead of actually printing the letters, which is, I guess they still do it, but at a smaller scale. What else? What else looks good? You guys have already been reading through the list and ignoring me. What do you got? Bill Clinton is a senior statesman. Wow. Never have seen an airplane ticket. I mean, you start to think about how this stuff changes you, right?
Or it's always been a woman's job in the State Department.
Oh, interesting. That's true as well, isn't it? No Henry Kissinger or whoever.
Yeah, or the football team not being...
Or Baker. Anyone remember? Oh yeah, there's so many cities that didn't used to. When I grew up in the 70s and early 80s, to be a guy, you had to memorize all the football teams, right? And so, now there's a whole new list of cities that would have never were on any list. The only football team when I was growing up in Florida was the Miami Dolphins. Now, how many are there? Does Tampa have a team now, too?
Yes.
Well, oh, there was also Tampa Bay back then. Sorry, there was also Tampa Bay.
Oh man, there've always been blue M&Ms, but no tan ones.
Yes.
Wow.
Who remembers tan M&Ms? And some of this is a trip down memory lane. It used to be tan, and it used to be all shades of tan. I don't remember. And red was poisonous because they finally figured out that red caused cancer. Like the dye that makes red, not just red M&Ms, but red anything. And I don't remember when, we could probably look it up, but there was at some point when all of a sudden, candy could be red again, food could be red again. And I remember the first time you eat a red M&M, I remember thinking, my God, we're going to die. We're all going to die. Because we have been taught, don't eat red things. Because we used to be so scared of cancer. Not that we are. Newt Gingrich.
Star Wars has always been
He
just
taught it
a
last
not a
school.
defense strategy.
Oh my God, how did they kill Star Wars like that? We won't even talk. Okay, let's see. Simba has always had trouble waiting to be king. Whoa, nobody knows what Romper Room is? I barely remember what that is. Remember Punky Brewster? I mean, some of that is the pop cultural stuff that Matsumoto's talking about, right? That stuff doesn't count.
History always has had its own channel.
J.R. Ewing, I mean, I remember the fever in our country. Do you remember the fever in our country over J.R. Ewing in Dallas? I mean, I remember some of the first pop cultural T-shirts. You could buy T-shirts that said, who shot J.R. on them? And it was like the coolest thing in the world is to ask that question. But nowadays, everyone has T-shirts that says things on them now. History has always had its own channel. Don't you love that? I mean, some of this stuff is just fascinating. And you start to realize, how could this change? One of the things that I think sometimes we stop and marvel at, and I don't know if it's listed up here or not, but this just made me think of it, this point-and-shoot thing. An entire Dow Jones Industrial Company has gone bankrupt in the span of 10 years. I mean, completely obliterated in the span, one of the largest companies in the universe, known universe, has been obliterated within 10 years. I just happen to have a personal spot for it because it's headquartered, or was headquartered, in my hometown of Rochester, New York. But Kodak is no longer anything. I mean, they filed bankruptcy earlier this year. Unbelievable, right? You can't buy their stock for a penny, just to let you know, right? Used to trade at $75 a share. Okay, so it's unbelievable. Genomes of living things have always been sequenced. That was in the last 10 years that we sequenced the human genome. We live in an amazing world that's changing way too fast. And the argument goes that has important consequences. Let me give you just one idea, right? So, books on DVR? What is this example? What I love about this is you have to hear my story, or else that won't make any sense. And just briefly, I'll tell you. This is a number of years ago that this happened. I've got a million other examples, but this one in particular I think is pretty poignant because it takes some of that technological change that's hinted at in that mindset list, and it really lets you know, well, where does that rubber meet the road, right? How does this actually impact day-to-day functioning? Well, it changes your mindset. And so my son, a number of years ago, I was reading a book to him, and I can't remember why I had to get up and go grab something, but I had to stop reading for a second. I almost ruined it. I had to stop reading for a second and go do it. And so I had to, now of course I just say I have to pause the book, right? And of course I'm live reading it to him. I have to pause what I'm doing. And his idea oh, no, I didn't have to get up. He did. He had to go run to the bathroom or something, or go get a napkin or something. And he told me, Dad, pause the book. See, I ruined my example, but he said, pause the book. I'm the one reading it, right? It's not an electronic book. So that's what DVRs does, right? And I can't tell you the numerous conversations that we have almost on a weekly basis. We're explaining to one of our kids, no, this is live TV. And I never heard of that idea before. Unless it was actually an event that was happening right then. But somehow my kid my kid just turned 7, still sort of gets it and sort of doesn't. The idea, oh, this is live TV, so we can't rewind it. Yes, that's right. And it's happened to me too. It's changed my outset and the things that I think about. How many times have you heard something cool on the radio and not paid attention because, you could just rewind it, right? You can't rewind the radio, or maybe you can, I don't know. Do you guys have, yes, you can? Okay. Why you want to, I don't know, but...
We can find like the transcripts and whatnot on.
Oh, sure. Yeah, now, you can. So it doesn't matter anymore, right? What's...
Yeah.
Huh?
You can listen to it online.
Or you can do podcasts.
Crazy. Crazy, right?
You can rewind.
Everything is recorded and reversible. We can time shift, basically. In the year 2012, we have time machines, and we've had them for a while, right? They're not quite as cool as we were told they were going to be, but they get us mostly just in trouble, I think.
One of my favorite lines from my nephew was, we were watching something that wasn't recorded, and he's like, "Aunt Kelly, fast forward." And I'm like, "I can't. It's like speed." He's like, "So I gotta watch commercials."
Yeah, oh yeah. Yeah, so I have to, how old? A 3-year-old saying, so I have to watch commercials? What is this, right? Or,
Watch it, just like fast forward with
that's what you do. You don't watch commercials, you fast forward through them. You watch them on high speed.
I wonder how long commercials will stay around, or before they just start doing just the constant sidebars throughout.
Oh, yeah. And then there'll
Because
be,
it's so pointless.
then there'll be
You
ways
don't
to
wanna
hope-
fuck that if you can.
yeah,
You can just why watch them?
yeah.
Even if you watch it online, something that's already taped, they'll make you stop
They
like
force
halfway
you.
through.
Yeah, no, that's
And
annoying.
It has a timer on it though, until you can skip.
We have no patience for that, right? I don't know if you,
Usually you have to watch a minute of commercials.
do you guys remember back in the,
CNN, it's a minute.
I guess I could say back in 2005, but for a fact I'll also say, remember back in the 90s when, back in the 80s, what did you used to do? What was commercial break time for?
Get something to eat, go to the bathroom.
Yeah. And so you got really good at fixing grilled cheese and going to the bathroom in 2.5 minutes, right? and so nowadays you could do that anytime you want, press pause, rewind. It's unbelievable. One last little mini example. So we're like part of that weird group of people who got rid of our cable 3 years ago. We have rabbit ears that actually pulls in stunning HD, over $10 rabbit ears. I still can't believe it. Occasionally, PBS in particular doesn't shoot their signal strong enough or in the right direction or something. And I live in town, and it's fairly close to the station, so it's irritating. But every now and then, you get the digitized blocking. And my 3-year-old has invented a new term and has gifted me with this example. He says the TV's scratched. Because that's what DVDs do when they're scratched, right? When it's having trouble playing, is it stutters and it blocks up. And so he says the TV's scratched, got to get a new one. So, and here's the thing, not just trivial things. I mean, the argument here is that we think your mind is changing. The way you think about time, the way you think about the linearity of things or the non-linearity, we think people are changing as a result of these historical and technological changes. That's the argument we're making. So culture does happen, does change, because the world changes. All right. So a couple of things I want to show you here. There's going to be a couple activities that I referred to on this PowerPoint, and they're now all scanned and available for you in the folder on Vista. And so activity 1.9. Let me just show you where this is. I think I have to do that. Is under activities for you folks. And 1.9 is something we're going to do, actually, right now. It's a test of cultural knowledge. What do you know about the world? Kind of fun. And it leads up to the next little link that I have on the PowerPoint. Exploring the World Village. So I call this a test of your cultural knowledge. All right, so do this in your notes right there, and maybe you could do it on one line, separate your answers by commas if you want, or you can number it however you want to do it. Question 1, so assuming, do this. I don't know why they chose 1,000. Do it with 100. Imagine a village of 100 people that perfectly represented the world's population. Some of you might have seen this YouTube video before or been exposed to this recently. But it's a good test of, in a way, your own cultural bias. How well do you know the rest of the world, the other human beings, right? There's other human beings out there. We're only 300 million of them. All right. So if there was a village of 100 inhabitants that perfectly represented the Earth as we see it today, how many men would there be out of that 100? How many women? All right. That's your first question. How about these different languages here? How many would speak Arabic? How many Bengali? How many English? How many French? How many speak Hindustani? How many Malay Indonesian? How many speak Mandarin? How many out of those 100 people would speak Portuguese, Russian, or Spanish? Ooh, right? Good questions. Kind of fun. And you don't have to do it for all of them, but put some guesses down for some of them. And we have the answers, by the way. Religion. How many of those 100 people are atheists? So basically this is getting at percent, right? What percent of the world's population are atheists? What percent are Buddhists, Christians, Hindus? What percent of the world's population is Jewish? Muslim? Non-religious or other religions? So making a distinction here. Non-religious is not the same thing as atheist. Places of origin. How many people are from Africa? And either not now. I think when this says origin, it makes me think, can trace their ancestry back to Africa. How many can trace their ancestry back to Asia? Or the way this is set up. How many live there now? It's not clear. When it says origins, it makes me think where you're from. Just getting at ethnicity, but how many are Latin Americans? I realize I'm changing the question. And how many are North Americans? How many are from Oceania? We got to lump all that space together to get any numbers. How many are under the age of 16? That is, are decidedly children. How many are adults? Oh no, I'm sorry. How many are old adults? Older adults. Daily life. How many have access to clean drinking water? Uh-oh. This sounds like the beginning of a liberal rant. No, just a human rant. And I'm not going to make it. How many live in urban areas versus rural areas? What percent? How many live in substandard housing? Hopefully defined pretty clearly by 20 different dimensions. Have access to modern methods of contraception, are affected by mental health problems, or have AIDS, HIV or AIDS. How many, holy moly, look what the internationally defined poverty line is. So that would be, and that's per person, per capita, $2 per day. That would be about $720, $730 a year, annual income. No, that's how much they spend to maintain themselves. So they could make more than that. Maybe they make 1,000, but it costs them $700 or less per year to live. Whoa, whoa, that's like a car payment or two, right? Let alone all the other things that you have to pay. Education are illiterate adults who cannot read. Are children without access to school, and what percentage of the world's population has internet access? Is this interesting to think about? Fun to think about? All right, do you want to feel privileged about yourself? That's where we're at. Here we are. Slideshow from current. Here we go. Oh, watch, this doesn't work. So this is miniatureearth.com. You can also get this by, there's lots of variations of this, even stealing this on YouTube. In fact, this is probably hosted on YouTube. It is. And so, give this a second to load. And they put sad music behind it too, just for added effect. I guess that's the best quality we're going to get. This is called the Miniature Earth, and they'll tell you what the rules are, I think, on their first slide. So this is what you just did. So here's the answers. Oh, and there's no sound. Okay, that's fine then. That's just fine.
Probably move the smart.
How?
You just gotta
We
move
did
it.
it last time, remember?
I gotta touch it?
Oh, Lord.
Will that work? Did something-
Grab the bar, grab the toolbar. No, not that toolbar, the smart
Where it
ink
says
toolbar.
smart.
Where it says smart ink. So grab that and drag it.
Yeah.
There you go.
See, that's generational communication right there. I love it. Okay, so once again, Gen Y. No, you got me back.
That's a good one for that.
Thanks.
Why?
Where did the thing go? Oh, this is now in the way. so smart, we need to get rid of it. And escape. There we go. And it's playing without us, despite the fact that I told it not to. Okay, here we go. We're doing it. All right. Deep breath. That's out of 100 people, right? Wow, how does that work? How does that work? So 50 men, 50 women. And look at that, might be surprising to you. Nearly half of human beings live in urban areas. Here's religion. A third of the world's population is Christian. It's pretty amazing. One 1% Jewish. Pretty amazing, right?
That's higher than expected.
Yeah.
So 43 of your 100 people will live without sanitation or anything like an improved water resource. 20 out of your 100 will own 75% of the entire community. That's not as shocking, I don't think, as it used to be. So 88% can read. Oh, that's a world, I'm sure a historical high, that is. 88% don't have a computer. And that wasn't even broadband, just a connection. One adult has AIDS. That might be lower than you thought. 1 trillion on military. So a fifth of the world's population lives on less than $1. I mean, those commercials were right. They weren't lying to you. You can live on less than $1 a day. So, you know, there's some kind of a mess. It's hard to look at those numbers and not have some kind of a message behind it. But I think it's a positive message. All right. I do want to get, as we close today, I do want to have some sound. So bear with me here. We'll actually attempt to do the sound thing. It's supposed to have sound. If it doesn't, it's going to ruin my big thing at the end here.
This might be loud.
Well, that was already on 2, and it wasn't doing anything, so. Okay, we're going to get some sound now. Amazing. Why we didn't get sound on the video, YouTube? All right. Who's seen Where is Matt? Where in the World is Matt? You want to see some cultural groups and cultural diversity? 2 of you have. The rest of you have not. You 2 know the treat that they're in for, right? This will make you feel good about human beings. I think, right? Don't let me tell you how to feel. Okay, here we go. I do that all day. So we're going to get rid of this. We're going to go to this. Here it is. Now, who this guy is, I think he did it first and then he got funding for it, or the other way around. Well, it sort of matters which order. Pretty sure he did a couple of the countries, and then he told Stride Gum, hey, wouldn't this be great for an advertisement? And they're like, yeah, sure, here's $200,000 to go travel around the world. Where do I get that job? And it's called Where the Hell is Matt? I know, I'm sorry about the HE double hockey sticks. He's got a new version out, and I don't know which one we're going to see here. That's the 2012. I want you to see the original one. Where is it? Okay, Dancing 2008. This is it. So this is the original video. I hate Smart Ink. The music is cool too.
Tap that one at the very top right.
You mess it up is what happens. Risked his life for that. With a Lamborghini.